My next two guests understand this topic really well as they represent Michigan in Congress. I just talked about Michigan as one of the nation's biggest manufacturing, muscle sites, along with Indiana, state famous for its manufacturing prowess. Representative Dan Kildee represents Michigan's 5th district and is the chief deputy whip and a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Representative Haley Stevens is the lead sponsor of the American Manufacturing Leadership Act. She's the chairwoman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee and represents Michigan's 11th district. Great to have you. Dan, it's great to see you. He and I have traveled around the world together. It's good to see you online. You're looking great. Let me just start out with you for a moment, Dan. When you kind of look at this question of I want to go back a year ago. And a year ago, we were having a seizure in this country when it came to PPE, thinking about global supply chains. We didn't have a vaccine yet. Can you kind of give us a kind of fast forward now today? What have we solved in your mind and what is still wobbly?
Well, first of all, thanks for including us in this conversation. It's good to see you. We've hopefully learned a lot. I think what we found out in the immediate moments of that crisis is that our supply chain and our access to critical supplies was severely limited. And I think it's largely because we'd become, complacent as a nation in believing that we had access to the global supply chain regardless of condition, regardless of circumstance, and that it was ready and available. And of course, what we found in this pandemic is that entire supply chain was disrupted, and the demand was so great that we had, obvious shortages. What we did quickly was to adapt, and we saw that happening, certainly here in the state of Michigan, where manufacturers quickly adjusted. Carhartt making masks, GM even getting in the business of making ventilators. I think about my own son, who's a custom ski maker in northern Michigan, who spent months quickly adapting and then spent months making face shields, surgical face shields to supply health care workers on the front lines. We don't want to have to do that again. As much as we can be proud of the fact that our American manufacturers proved to be agile, the hope is that what we've learned is that we have to have a much greater degree of preparedness to quickly turn our manufacturing capabilities to serve our needs and not put ourselves, and this is where the supply chain issues come into place, not put ourselves where the material is not available to us, even if we have the manufacturing capacity to execute. So I think it remains to be seen the extent to which we've learned that lesson. I think it's going to be important that the after action plan for all of this does not have us taking our guard down the way it was in early 2020 when this all hit.
Right. Representative Stevens, you're one of the lead sponsors of the American Manufacturing Leadership Act. And again, just one of the things I'm trying to sort of figure out at this moment, right now, I think two things are saving the country. One, the pharmaceutical industry and what has happened by way of vaccines, and also manufacturers and what's happening. But what does the American Manufacturing Leadership Act accomplish that needs to be accomplished?
Yeah, well, it's great that you tie pharmaceuticals in with your thinking about what is saving the country vis-a-vis manufacturing. With AMLA, the American Manufacturing Leadership Act, which was the reauthorization of a 5-year bill previously known as the Revitalizing American Manufacturing Innovation Act, we said, why don't we just condense this, focus on R&D efforts, focus on the supply chain, and look at workforce development opportunities. And much of this ties into what exists in mega consortiums around this country focused on various research concentrations in advanced manufacturing. We've got an institute in Youngstown, Ohio, for instance, that is focused on 3D printing. It's known as America Makes. We've got a lightweight manufacturing metals institute located in Detroit. We've got photonics and on. And we have a pharmaceuticals manufacturing institute. So it's really important that we got that legislation done and signed into law. When we were doing the CARES Act, in particular, we made sure that additional monies went forward for our manufacturing extension partnership centers, along with the same biopharmaceutical manufacturing institute that's working with dozens of universities, dozens of for-profit companies in this space, and even some of the nonprofits. And when you talked to them a year ago and you said, how do you think we're going to be in terms of the vaccine? They were already mapping this out before we had the vaccine ready to go. And so all of this, in many respects, as my colleague was talking about, we're overcoming the supply chain disruptions, but we're utilizing and leveraging a vast network of public-private partnerships, the way in which the government comes to the table with private industry and our small manufacturers to help them modernize, to help them evolve, and continue to meet some of their production needs. So I remain really enthusiastic about what we got done with the American Manufacturing Leadership Act and what we're continuing to build off of that in this present time.
Haley, let me ask you a question. I think Dan Kildee and I are probably at the age now where we're having lots of Back to the Future moments where, I'm just sort of seeing here, you used to work with you were chief of staff for the U.S. Auto Rescue Task Force. And you probably worked with Steve Ratner, a lot of folks I knew in those days. And, at that time, you could not say in the Obama administration the word industrial policy. It was just, you could not, it was banned. There was a banned word, a banned term. It seems to be back, industrial is being smart about industrial policy, particularly with manufacturing, thinking about vaccines, thinking about national security. Are we back in a time, and I'll ask you both of this, where industrial policy is something we need to embrace and not be dumb at, but be smart at?
Sure. I worked directly for Steve Ratner, and
you remember that he wouldn't let anybody say those words.
Right. Yeah. Well, we named Ron Bloom the co-head of the manufacturing policy efforts, and maybe I'm breaking a rule, but I say we were doing industrial policy for the first time, in decades. I don't know, what was managing or overseeing the use of the language there, but yeah, I think you're spot on that we are doing industrial policy. If you look at the executive order that the White House put out on supply chains and the way industry is reacting to it, and particularly some of the former policymakers who are now on the outside saying, we've never seen anything like this. I mean, this goes really deep. I mean, that is the step towards industrial policy. We're looking at the utilization of the Defense Production Act around the vaccine. We're thinking about Defense Production Act 2.0, how we can continue to meet some of our manufacturing needs. We'll say buy American, make it in America, but that can't be lip service. To really do that, we've got to think concertedly about how we fix and address this missing middle where we're sourcing products and goods overseas where we're not yet making them here in the United States.
Dan, thank you for that. Dan, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, you can tell how great it is to have Haley Stevens as a colleague. I mean, a person who comes with the kind of experience that she has in a state that is so focused on the future of manufacturing. We're just really fortunate that she's in that position. So it's great to have her as a colleague. I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about industrial policy that it is a broad set of subjects. And I'll just give you a couple of examples where I think we are moving toward having a more deliberate industrial policy. Number one, the future, we know the future is within our grasp. Thinking about us as a manufacturing state, but particularly focused on auto manufacturing. In the future, a significant percentage of vehicles on the road are going to be electric vehicles. We have to make a decision as to whether or not we're going to embrace that future and have industrial policy like the electric vehicle tax credit, like infrastructure that improves access to charging stations, like battery technology that we can support not only through research, but through tax incentives to drive that kind of innovation so that we don't concede the market, which is only at 2% right now in the US, but the future market for electric vehicles is going to be filled by someone. A nation with an industrial policy incentivizes the production of electric vehicles here in the U.S. by providing consumer credits and lots of other things. The other thing is to make sure we're dealing with the enforcement requirements we have. Polysilicon. I represent a company called Hemlock Semiconductor. Most of the solar cell development and manufacturing takes place in China, and now most of the polysilicon is being essentially offshored. We need to enforce much of that polysilicon is produced in Xinjiang by essentially slave labor. We need to work with our allies to take enforcement actions to protect American manufacturing by not allowing American manufacturers and American workers to be undercut by slave workers in Xinjiang and other places around the world. So these are elements of an industrial policy that we have to make sure are being robustly conceptualized and executed.
You know, it's such an important point. I'm glad you raised it. Let me ask you both another question. I was out socially distant, COVID appropriate, having drinks with a friend of mine from Johnson & Johnson, and we were talking about their partnership with their rival Merck. The J&J vaccine, which has now come online, in many cases is now they're in partnership with Merck, and they're working with manufacturers here in the United States but elsewhere in the world. I've got a long list here of Sanofi, Takeda, Novartis, J&J, Bayer, even firms like Teva Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest generic pharmaceutical company in the world, is working with Pfizer. They don't hang out on the beach together, these companies. And they're working together, and I guess I don't want to, realize that this is a kumbaya moment, but it's remarkable to sort of look at the partnerships that developed even among classic rivalries. And I don't know whether that can be bottled or held in place or what lessons are learned. But Haley, I'd just like to ask you, you learned this in the auto case. How can we learn from this moment and somehow create institutional memory of taking our manufacturing muscle, our science and expertise muscle? So, because I am sure that we're going to be in moments like this again in our future, and it would be nice not to have to reinvent all of this.
Yeah, and we're not just doing it in moments of crisis, although this one is certainly unique and right in front of us with the partnerships and collaboration opportunities. We, for so long, have been in a very black and white space, competition, competitor companies, not coming to the table together. The 21st century hits, and all of a sudden you see sure, some of the problems, but also the opportunities at such a scale that it begets coming together. I was working in a digital manufacturing space, looking at the utilization of large data sets. Sometimes this is known as IIoT, Industrial Internet of Things. And you see the big companies, their suppliers, all railing around supply chain visibility, maintenance and repair through real-time delivery, and yet the co-investment in the R&D was happening with competitor companies coming to the table with the federal government. I'm talking GE and Rolls-Royce, John Deere and Caterpillar, and on and on and on. And this is a real thing that's been happening in the United States of America for, going on almost, 8 years here. So the framework and to go back to what you're talking about with the American Manufacturing Leadership Act, that gives us that framework to collaborate, to compete. And certainly it's a great opportunity before us, but it does help with innovation. I'm doing the same thing with plastics and the circular economy, bringing everyone to the table to talk about how we can promote better supply chain opportunities at the local level to recycle single-use plastics. This is something we've been over-reliant on China on for way too long. This slapped us in the face, 4 or 5 years ago now, and we've got the opportunity to develop this. But by finger pointing and blaming or just forcing one entity to shoulder all the costs, that's not going to cut it. And that's the same thing with this vaccine. It's real lives, real-time manufacturing, on-time delivery that is needed. And so it's a thing of beauty. It's a great best practice in play. You were absolutely spot on to talk about this with the auto rescue. We saw this, when it was GM and Chrysler that needed the rescue, but Ford, Toyota, Honda all came to the table and said, don't let these companies liquidate. So you see this occurring in these stark moments of need, but they're also happening on the R&D side we need to think a little bit more clearly. And where I'm focused, and part of my upcoming legislative portfolio with the National Manufacturing Guard Act, is bringing all the players to the table to avoid further disruptions and continue to catapult what we're doing here in Michigan and in many places around the country, making, producing, and providing good jobs for people.
Great. Thanks. Representative Kildee, I'm going to ask you to give a brief answer, because I want to bring Julia Manchester in, because she's going to have a whopper question for you, I'm sure. But your thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have a big challenge, here in this country. I think what we need to do is get ourselves back in the game. Haley is one of these leaders that I just listen to every time she opens her mouth on these subjects. So I'm with her. Let's put it that way.
Okay, that's great. Julia,
she flatters me, because I listen to Dan Kildee every time he opens his mouth on these things.
Okay, Julia?
That's a lot.
I guess to both of you, going forward on, this issue of the production of the vaccine and such, with members of Congress, are we seeing more of a collaboration with Republicans and Democrats in terms of, I guess, rolling out the vaccine more quickly? I know it's in a way a corporate issue, but what are members of Congress doing?
Well, I think there are areas where we do have agreement. There are lots of areas where we don't. We're particularly proud in Michigan, of course, that we have, Pfizer manufacturing right in Portage, Michigan. We have Johnson & Johnson facility in Grand Rapids. And I know among our Michigan delegation, we take a great deal of pride in that and try to stay as unified and organized around supporting those efforts as we can. And I don't, not to go into a more contentious area, but I think we have to lead by example also. And I'll just say this, it's disappointing that we haven't been able to get back to sort of regular order in Congress with normal vote schedules and normal committee hearings, because, a quarter of the U.S. House of Representatives refuses to take this vaccine and allow us to get back to some sort of normal. So as much as policy is important, and I think we are united for the most part on that, we lead by example to a great extent, and there's been a bit of a disappointment in that regard.
I want to get an audience question in here real quick, but I want to slip in one other quick, fast question. I've talked to Jay Timmons, the president of the National Association of Manufacturers, about what is one of the biggest things on his radar screen about any concerns about the manufacturing sector. And one of them is workforce and workforce development, workforce training, the partnerships. That if you look at the manufacturing workforce, it is aging. It is not. So I guess that's going to require partnerships, investment, outreach, and it's going to require some investment by the government. Are we making those investments, Dan, Haley? Quick thoughts on that?
Absolutely, we're making these investments. We just passed a big apprenticeship bill. You're probably going to see some of this even tie into what we're doing on infrastructure coming out of what we have done with the American Rescue Act. What was one of the big ticket items in there? Support for our schools, dollars for our schools. And that's going to be on the personnel front, the programmatic front. We're here in Michigan. Dan knows this. We've got the largest number of FIRST robotics teams of any state in the country. That's producing high school students who see themselves in manufacturing, who see themselves in engineering careers, in a variety of different professions in which, you can do the communication, the sales, you can do the actual production. But make no mistake about it, the projected skills gap is high. We're talking millions of job openings in a period where we've got high unemployment, and yet we don't have the people lining up to take the jobs. This is something we reckon with in the Great Recession and the years following from it. And so where I am pushing and working with the stakeholders, looking and evaluating the dollars that we're spending at the federal level, state and local, plus the corporate social responsibility, the nonprofit foundation activity. If you add that up, we're talking a space in which the money is there. It's the human capital considerations. Some of this begins with culture changes, putting dollars and cents on these professions and career trajectories, bringing our labor unions to the table. Again, this is holistic. And then certainly reckoning with global competition and the need to recruit global talent. We tend to silo ourselves when we look at some of these challenges that we're facing. And so I've been working with a lot of the same partners, ASMEs, SME, on and on, National Association of Manufacturers,
Right.
and saying, hey, let's also think global here too.
Thank you. Dan, I'd love to get your thoughts, and we'll take a question from the audience.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with Haley. I think one of the aspects that we need to continue to focus more attention on are the inequities when it comes to talent development. I, for example, working with Congressman Blumenauer, who chairs our trade subcommittee on Ways and Means, to rethink and rewrite trade adjustment assistance. So we're delivering not only skills to workers who are trying to move from the old economy to the next economy, but also helps erase some of the big deficits in those communities with a community-wide trade adjustment approach to help a whole community get back to the starting line. And of course, we have to talk about K-12 investment, because it's difficult to talk about post-secondary preparation for the workforce without teaching critical thinking and other basic skills in a more equitable fashion in the K-12 system.
Right, holistic answers. That's absolutely right. We have a question for you folks from Paul Kelly. Paul?
Hi, Paul Kelly here. I'm with the Livingston Group, a lobbying firm here in Washington. And I want to thank The Hill and Steve Clemens for this great webinar, and thanks to the panelists. I was wondering what the panelists' views were on the patent protection that the pharmaceutical manufacturers receive for creating the COVID vaccine. Thanks.
Interesting question, Paul. Thank you.
You put your finger on a really interesting and I think difficult issue, which we're going to be wrestling with in the very near future, and that's the IP protections as we think about the global challenge, because there is an interest and a need for us to find out how we can expand and accelerate vaccine production in other parts of the world by sharing IP. Now, I haven't come to any conclusion on that, except that I understand the problem and we're going to have to work this. And I'm really interested in input on this. I don't think we can take the position that we have enough production capacity to meet world demand without coming up with some form of partnership to allow production capabilities in other parts of the world to ramp up production. It's not just in their interest, it's also in our interest to make sure we crush this pandemic on the African continent, on the subcontinent, other places where if we don't get to this until 2022 or 2023, this could rebound and hit us again in a way that's really not in anyone's interest morally or economically or in any other sense. So this is a thorny issue. We're going to have to get our arms around it sooner rather than later.
Quick thought, Haley?
Yeah, it's spot on in terms of what we were talking about with the collaboration as well as the modernization needs here. And it certainly begets the attention not only of the executive office, but certainly those of us in the legislative body. And if you read the scientific journals, as I do, this pandemic isn't going off like a light switch. I mean, we're going to be reckoning with this for a long time. The vaccine needs are going to stretch well into next year. Still questions around booster shots. And so pushing on the patent considerations as well as the production and delivery vehicles are going to continue to be a major focus of ours.
Well, listen, I want to thank Representative Haley Stevens and Representative Dan Kildee. Dan, member of the House Ways and Means Committee, Chief Deputy Whip. I hope I get to travel with you, somewhere around the world one of these days, as we have in the past. And Haley Stevens, lead sponsor of the American Manufacturing Leadership Act. Thank you both so much for joining us. It was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.